So Carney froze the one access point Washington wanted reopened, and Europe was already waiting on the other side. The White House announced additional 50% tariffs on nearly $20 billion in Canadian goods, and said Canada had 30 days before the duties began on August 19th. Washington's complaint was blunt. Canadian provinces had removed or severely restricted American beer, wine, and spirits. Ottawa maintained disputed rules on U.S. vehicles and dairy, and American products were being treated less favorably than goods from other countries. Trump expected the threat to force a quick reopening. Instead, Mark Carney said provincial access for American alcohol should return only as part of a comprehensive settlement. The shelves stayed empty. The pressure point remained frozen. And while Washington waited for Canada to restore the old channel, Europe had already opened a new one through a €150 billion defense procurement system, with a Canadian contract, nearly 100 suppliers, and deliveries running through 2030. Warren Buffett's economic logic reduces the reversal to one sentence. The customer loses leverage when the seller can leave the shelf empty and still find another buyer. That does not mean Canada escaped the American market. A 50% tariff can still close factories, weaken the Canadian dollar, reduce shifts, and damage retirement portfolios on both sides of the border. Nor did Carney personally control every provincial liquor board. Most provinces regulate their own alcohol sales. The title describes the strategic effect. Carney refused to make restored U.S. access a freestanding concession, while Canada's European alternative was already operating. When you hear what happened during the reconstructed call between Ottawa, the premiers, and Washington, why one empty shelf became more powerful than a tariff proclamation, and why the first European contract changed the room, you will understand why this was never only about bottles. Hit subscribe because Washington was trying to reopen yesterday's market while Canada was negotiating tomorrow's one. And the deeper story begins with how American access became the most visible symbol of a relationship that had stopped feeling reciprocal. For decades, the Canada-US trade relationship worked because both countries accepted a basic bargain. Canada would remain deeply integrated with the world's largest economy, and the United States would exercise its power through stable rules rather than sudden coercion. Auto components crossed the border several times before a finished vehicle reached a dealership. Canadian energy flowed to American refineries. American machinery entered Canadian factories. Farmers, retailers, banks, railways, pension funds, and border communities built their lives around a continental system worth roughly $1.6 trillion a year across Canada, the United States, and Mexico. The arrangement was unequal in scale. It was supposed to be equal in rules. That confidence eroded as tariffs became recurring political instruments. Steel and aluminum were targeted. Automobile policies became a battlefield. Softwood lumber remained unresolved. Washington declined to provide the USMCA with another clean 16-year extension, forcing companies to plan around annual reviews and a possible 2036 expiry. Then came the symbolic retaliation that ordinary consumers could see. Canadian provinces began removing American alcohol from government-controlled shelves in response to earlier U.S. tariffs. Most provinces either banned or severely restricted American beer, wine, and spirits. Alberta and Saskatchewan were the principal exceptions. According to Reuters, U.S. alcohol imports into Canada had fallen sharply, and the White House cited the provincial restrictions as evidence of discrimination. Carney said the provinces should lift those bans only as part of a broader trade settlement, not as an isolated favor to Washington. That decision mattered because alcohol was never the largest part of the economic relationship. It was the most visible. A shopper could see the empty space where an American bourbon, California wine, or imported beer had once stood. A provincial premier could point to the shelf and say Canada was responding. A U.S. producer could measure lost sales immediately. Washington's July 20 action transformed that retail symbol into a national confrontation. The White House invoked Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930 and imposed additional duties of 50% on selected Canadian products tied to alcohol, vehicles, dairy, and other goods. The duties were scheduled for August 19 and would apply to covered goods even if they otherwise qualified under USMCA. The U.S. Trade Representative estimated the targeted imports at nearly $20 billion. About 5.2% of American goods imports from Canada in 2025. The strategy was designed around three numbers: 50%, nearly $20 billion, 30 days. But Canada had three different numbers: 150 billion euros, nearly 100 suppliers, deliveries through 2030. On February 14th, Canada signed an agreement allowing Canadian firms and Canadian origin products to participate in procurement under Europe's Safe Defence Instrument. On June 15th, the European Council formally concluded the agreement, making Canada the first non-European participant. A Montreal-based company had already secured a contract exceeding $10 million to supply Canadian-made tactical radios to Polish Cyber Command. Nearly 100 Canadian suppliers were expected to participate. Deliveries would extend through 2030. Ottawa was also expanding domestic procurement. Its Buy Canadian policy had already applied to solicitations valued above $3 billion, with more than $726 million in contracts awarded by late June. Ottawa lowered the threshold for strategic Canadian preference from $25 million to $5 million, bringing roughly 5 times more federal procurements within reach of the policy. Physical infrastructure was moving as well. A $5 billion Trade Diversification Corridors Fund and a $1 billion Arctic Infrastructure Fund were already accepting proposals for ports, railways, airports, northern roads, bridges, and dual-use infrastructure. The purpose was explicit: connect Canadian producers to more global customers and help double non-U.S. exports over the next decade. Washington believed the empty alcohol shelves were temporary retaliation that a large enough tariff could reverse. Ottawa increasingly saw them as one piece of a much wider bargaining system. And then the dispute entered a secure room where an empty shelf, a European contract, and a 30-day deadline were placed on the same table. What follows is a composite reconstruction based on official statements, provincial positions, reported negotiations, procurement documents, and the public timeline. It is not a verbatim transcript of a private meeting. The room is inside Ottawa's government complex, behind a controlled door where phones are collected. A long maple table sits beneath recessed lights. On the wall is a split screen. The left side shows a Canadian liquor store. The shelves are clean, evenly lit, and partly empty. Small white labels remain beneath spaces where American products used to sit. One shelf carries Canadian whiskey. Another carries bottles from France, Italy, Spain, Ireland, and other countries. The missing American products create a visible break in the pattern. The right side shows a map of North Atlantic defense and trade routes. Canada is connected to Poland, France, Germany, Britain, and the wider European market. A small gold line marks the first safe contract. On the table are 4 binders. The white binder contains the American proclamations and the August 19 effective date. The red binder carries the 3 pressure figures: 50%, nearly $20 billion, 30 days. The blue binder contains the SAFE agreement, the Polish contract, nearly 100 Canadian suppliers, and deliveries through 2030. The black binder contains Buy Canadian procurement, emergency business financing, the $5 billion Corridor Fund, and the $1 billion Arctic Fund. Prime Minister Mark Carney sits with trade, finance, industry, transport, and intergovernmental officials. Provincial leaders appear on secure video screens because the decision Washington wants is not entirely Ottawa's decision. Provincial liquor boards control most alcohol distribution and sales. The trade minister begins with the American demand. Washington wants discriminatory treatment removed. The provincial restrictions on U.S. alcohol are central because they are easy to explain politically. The United States also wants changes involving vehicles and dairy. If Canada moves, the 50% duties can be reduced, modified, or terminated before August 19th. Carney asks how many provinces are willing to restock immediately. The answer comes by region. Alberta and Saskatchewan are already less restrictive. British Columbia is firmly opposed. Its premier has publicly said there is no chance American alcohol will return under current conditions. Ontario wants a forceful response and has called for dollar-for-dollar measures. Other provinces are prepared to coordinate but do not want to surrender their most visible retaliatory tool without a larger agreement. The intergovernmental official leans toward the microphone. Even if Ottawa wanted to reopen the shelves, he says in the reconstruction, the premiers own the keys. The sentence hangs in the room. Washington's chosen pressure point is fragmented across provincial authority. The federal government can negotiate, persuade, and coordinate. It cannot simply order every liquor board to restock as if Canada were one national retailer. Carney looks at the empty shelf image. What does Washington think it is buying with the tariff? The trade minister answers, immediate access. And what are the provinces demanding? A complete settlement. The difference is the conflict. A secure call opens with American officials. The precise dialogue is not public. The following exchange reflects the known positions of both governments. The American lead begins with the proclamation. Canada has 30 days. A 50% duty will strike nearly $20 billion in products if discrimination remains. American alcohol producers have lost shelf access. U.S. vehicle exporters face Canadian tariffs and quotas. Dairy producers face restrictions. Washington expects concrete action. Carney's response is measured. Canada is prepared to negotiate all outstanding issues in a comprehensive agreement. The American official narrows the request. Start with alcohol. Carney glances toward the provincial screens. The provinces will consider access as part of the settlement. The American lead asks for a commitment before the settlement. Carney does not give one. The room becomes quiet. 5 seconds. Then 10. The air system can be heard above the lights. On the left screen, the empty shelf remains unchanged. The American official increases the pressure. Nearly $20 billion is exposed. 50% can make covered Canadian products uncompetitive. 30 days is not much time. Carney looks at the blue binder. 30 days is not much time to rebuild a market, he says in the reconstruction. It is also not enough time to reverse agreements already signed. The safe document is opened. February 14th, June 15th. The Polish contract. Nearly 100 suppliers. Deliveries through 2030. The American side asks why European defense procurement is relevant to provincial liquor access. The Canadian Trade Minister answers, because both questions are about whether Canadian access to the American market can be used to control Canada's access to every other market. Silence. 5 seconds. Then 10. The American official says Washington is not asking Canada to leave Europe. It is asking Canada to stop treating American products worse than European products. Carney makes the distinction that changes the meeting. Then negotiate the rule, he says. Do not demand the symbol. The symbol is the empty shelf. The rule is the wider architecture. Tariffs, quotas, provincial authority, vehicles, dairy, procurement, exemptions, and the future of Uzbeka. Washington wants the shelf reopened first because it would demonstrate that the tariff created movement. Canada wants the shelf treated as one component of a comprehensive settlement because reopening it alone would demonstrate that pressure works. The American official asks whether Carney is willing to let Canadian manufacturers suffer to protect a provincial retail restriction. Carney's reconstructed answer is quiet. No, we are protecting manufacturers because we know the restriction is not the final issue. He points to the red binder. Today it is alcohol, vehicles, and dairy. Which shelf is next? No one speaks. The question reaches every official in the room. A company outside the nearly $20 billion category is not protected from the lesson. If Washington can select one visible Canadian measure, attach a 50% tariff, and force reversal in 30 days, every future dispute carries the same mechanism. The finance official opens the black binder. Canada will provide targeted credit and support for exposed companies. Buy Canadian procurement will keep more federal spending inside domestic supply chains. The threshold has fallen from $25 million to $5 million. The corridor funds will continue. European supplier matching will accelerate. The American lead returns to the central fact. The United States remains your largest customer. Carney does not challenge it. Yes. Then why risk access? Carney looks at the map on the right screen. Because the largest customer should not be the only customer. A pause follows. The American official asks whether Europe is replacing the United States. No, Carney says. Europe was already waiting. Your tariff made the introduction urgent. The line goes quiet. On the wall, the two images remain beside each other. An empty American shelf. An active European contract. The tariff is designed to fill the first image. The Canadian strategy is designed to expand the second. The call ends without agreement. The 50% duties remain scheduled. Nearly $20 billion remains exposed. No province announces a broad restocking. An aide asks Carney what message should go to the premiers. Carney closes the white tariff binder. Access returns with a deal, he says in the reconstruction. Not with fear. The provincial screens go dark one by one. The empty shelf stays on the wall. Then the display changes to the Polish contract and the list of nearly 100 Canadian suppliers. Nobody celebrates. The symbolic American channel remains frozen. The new European channel is already delivering. And the aftermath reveals why Washington's seemingly simple demand became much harder than the White House expected. The first complication was constitutional and practical. Provincial governments regulate alcohol sales. Carney could support a coordinated settlement, but he could not guarantee that every premier would immediately return American products to provincial shelves. British Columbia's position was openly defiant. Ontario wanted a forceful response. Other provinces saw the alcohol restrictions as one of the few retaliatory tools visible to ordinary citizens. According to Reuters, Carney said the bans should be lifted only as part of a broader trade agreement. That transformed the shelf from a unilateral Canadian concession into negotiating currency. Washington could still demand access. It now had to offer something large enough for Ottawa and the provinces to defend politically. The second complication was American dependence. The new 50% duties excluded energy, potash, critical minerals, fish, and products already covered by certain national security tariffs. Washington was willing to punish selected Canadian sectors. It was unwilling to disrupt every Canadian input American industries needed. The proclamation demonstrated power and exposed constraint at the same time. The third complication was time. The tariff would begin on August 19th, but the larger North American negotiation was not operating on a 30-day schedule. Washington was pursuing interim arrangements while acknowledging that major USMCA issues could extend into 2027. A short deadline was sitting on top of a long dispute. Markets responded first to vulnerability. The Canadian dollar weakened after the announcement. Businesses reviewed shipments, credit lines, and inventory. American importers calculated whether to advance purchases before August 19th. Canadian manufacturers asked what government support would exist if orders disappeared. But the strategic response moved in another direction. Canadian defense companies examined European tenders. Nearly 100 suppliers connected to the Polish radio contract gained a stronger reason to invest in compliance and capacity. Small businesses looked at a Buy Canadian system that had already awarded more than $726 million in contracts. Transport authorities and provinces prepared submissions to the $5 billion Corridor Fund. Northern governments examined the $1 billion Arctic Fund as both trade and sovereignty infrastructure. The most important shift occurred inside company planning. Executives stopped treating the provincial alcohol dispute as an isolated political event. They treated it as proof that any sector could become the next bargaining instrument. A furniture manufacturer asked whether its American customer base was too concentrated. A technology firm asked whether federal procurement could support a Canadian production line. A defense supplier asked how quickly it could qualify for a European consortium. A port authority asked which overseas route could become commercially viable with public funding. The 50% threat was aimed at reopening U.S. access to Canadian shelves. It was opening Canadian boardrooms to non-U.S. markets. Now, before I continue, I want to quickly mention something every American over 60 needs to see right now. Everything we have been covering, the tariffs, inflation, market volatility, and the pressure this trade conflict can place on retirement savings, I have compiled into a practical guide called the Buffett Blueprint. It applies Warren Buffett's long-term investment principles to the specific risks this trade war creates for your retirement. Your 401k, your Social Security, and your fixed income investments are all covered, along with a straightforward protection plan you can begin using this week. The link is directly below this video and in the pinned comment. It is called the Buffett Blueprint. And for calm, evidence-based coverage of the economic decisions affecting your money, make sure you are subscribed to the channel. Now, let's return to Buffett's framework and why he would judge this dispute by optionality rather than by counting bottles alone. That is where Warren Buffett's framework becomes essential, because Buffett would not judge the dispute by counting bottles alone. He would judge who gained optionality. The American alcohol producer lost immediate access to provincial shelves. Canada lost access to some American export revenue through threatened tariffs. Both sides were paying a price. The economic question is whether the price creates a durable advantage or merely a temporary wound. Buffett would begin with the empty shelf. A shelf is valuable because it connects a product to a customer. Once the product is removed, the space does not remain economically neutral. Another producer fills it. A Canadian distillery, French winery, Irish brewer, or other supplier gains visibility, distribution data, and customer familiarity. Even if American alcohol returns after a settlement, competitors may not surrender every new advantage. Retail habits can change. Importers can sign new contracts. Provincial buyers can diversify supply. That is the first compounding effect. The second appears in procurement. Canada's Buy Canadian policy has already applied to solicitations worth more than $3 billion. More than $726 million in contracts had been awarded by late June. Lowering the threshold from $25 million to $5 million means many more projects can include Canadian preference. The purpose is not to exclude every foreign supplier. It is to make domestic capacity more durable when foreign access becomes political. Buffett would warn that procurement preference can become wasteful if it protects weak companies forever. But he would also understand the value of keeping strategic suppliers alive during a temporary shock. An efficient country without production capacity can become dependent at the worst moment. The third effect is Europe. Canada's access to the €150 billion SAFE system is not a guaranteed revenue stream. Canadian companies must compete. They must meet standards, build partnerships, and deliver. The first contract exceeds $10 million, a tiny figure beside nearly $20 billion in threatened trade. But Buffett has never measured a new distribution channel only by the first order. The first order proves the channel works. Nearly 100 Canadian suppliers gain experience. Engineers learn European security requirements. Polish buyers gain a Canadian reference. Deliveries through 2030 create recurring contact. The second contract begins from a stronger position than the first. That is how small proof becomes a durable network. In more than 60 years of investing, acquiring companies, and watching dominant businesses lose customers, Warren Buffett has returned to one principle. Never force a customer to test whether the alternative is good enough. Before the test, loyalty may be habit. After the test, the customer has evidence. Washington's tariff forced Canada to test alternatives with urgency. The empty shelf tested whether Canadian consumers and provincial retailers could function without American alcohol. The Polish contract tested whether Canadian defense suppliers could sell through Europe. The Buy Canadian policy tested whether federal spending could sustain more domestic firms. The corridor funds tested whether physical geography could be made less restrictive. The universal principle is simple. A dominant partner's greatest asset is not access. It is the other side's belief that no credible substitute exists. Every successful substitute weakens that belief. That does not mean Canada can substitute for the United States entirely. It cannot. American demand is too large, too close, and too integrated. The same is true in reverse for many Canadian resources and inputs. The two economies remain joined. But a tariff does not need to create a complete divorce to backfire. It only needs to make the next Canadian investment less American than the last. Buffett's devastating verdict would be this. Washington tried to reopen one shelf and taught Canada to build another store. Pause on that. The 50% duties may still force concessions. The alcohol bans may eventually be lifted. American products may return. Yet the European certifications, domestic contracts, supplier relationships, and infrastructure proposals created during the dispute will not disappear with the first shipment of bourbon. That is why the consequences extend far beyond retail alcohol. The first cascading consequence is that provincial authority becomes a national bargaining asset and a national coordination problem. Washington cannot negotiate one simple restocking decision with Ottawa because most alcohol distribution is provincial. Carney needs cooperation from premiers with different economies, political incentives, and public moods. That makes a settlement harder to deliver. It also prevents Washington from assuming one federal signature automatically restores every form of access. The second consequence is substitution on Canadian shelves. American brands lose more than current sales when customers try competitors, and provincial buyers build alternative supply relationships. The longer restrictions last, the greater the chance that some market share becomes permanently harder to recover. The third consequence reaches American workers. Distillers, wineries, brewers, farmers, truckers, distributors, and packaging companies lose Canadian demand. A tariff intended to protect American industry is partly retaliation for damage already reaching American producers through reduced access. The fourth consequence reaches Canadian workers. The 50% duty targets products far beyond alcohol. Cement, furniture, clothing, dairy, sporting goods, and other categories can suffer. A Canadian town should not be treated as acceptable collateral in a symbolic shelf dispute. Ottawa must use credit, wage support, and procurement carefully to preserve viable employers without creating permanent dependence on subsidies. The fifth consequence is industrial reorientation. European defense procurement, domestic federal contracts, and transport corridors create new centers of employment. Quebec and Ontario can expand aerospace, communications, and manufacturing. Atlantic provinces can build port and maritime capacity. Western and northern regions can connect minerals, energy, roads, airports, and Arctic sovereignty. The sixth consequence reaches NORAD, Five Eyes, and the wider alliance. Trade restrictions do not end continental defense. Canada and the United States still share airspace, radar, intelligence, energy systems, and geography. But economic coercion changes political trust. European defense ties can strengthen NATO and Canadian capability, while reducing Washington's assumption that Canadian procurement will automatically flow south. The seventh consequence is international. Allies see the United States impose 50% duties on a close partner, partly because provinces removed American products in response to earlier U.S. tariffs. They see Canada respond through Europe, domestic procurement, and infrastructure. Their conclusion is not that America is weak. It is that dependence on American access requires insurance. China and Russia gain whenever Western partners invest energy in protecting themselves from one another. They do not need Canada to abandon Washington. They need Allied trust to become more conditional. The feedback loop is now visible. U.S. tariffs trigger Canadian restrictions. Canadian restrictions trigger new U.S. tariffs. New U.S. tariffs strengthen Canadian diversification. Diversification reduces future American leverage. Reduced leverage creates pressure for harsher measures. Harsher measures justify more diversification. Every turn makes the original relationship more expensive to restore. And that is why the final question is not whether American bottles eventually return to Canadian shelves. It is what the shelves will represent when they do. Carney did not freeze all American access to Canada. The United States still sells immense volumes of goods and services into the Canadian market. Nor did he personally order every provincial alcohol restriction. Most of those decisions belong to the provinces. The title captures the strategic choice. Carney said restored access for American alcohol should be part of a comprehensive deal. He did not offer it as an isolated concession under a 30-day threat. The shelves remained bargaining leverage while Washington's 50% duties threatened nearly $20 billion in Canadian goods. At the same time, Canada's new European channel was already waiting. The SAFE agreement had been signed on February 14th and concluded on June 15th. The first Canadian contract exceeded $10 million. Nearly 100 suppliers were involved. Deliveries ran through 2030. Buy Canadian procurement was already producing contracts. $6 billion in corridor and Arctic infrastructure funds were already active. The old access point was frozen. The new access point was operating. That is the philosophical lesson. Access is powerful only while it is scarce. Once a government uses access as a recurring threat, every alternative market, supplier, port, contract, and domestic customer becomes more valuable. The threatened country may still pay a heavy price, but it begins building a system in which the next threat purchases less. Warren Buffett's final verdict would be quiet and unforgiving. Trump demanded the old shelf back. Carney made sure Canada had somewhere else to place the product. The white binder still says August 19. The red binder still says 50%, nearly $20 billion, and 30 days. The empty shelf still represents American access withheld. The blue binder still says 150 billion euro, nearly 100 Canadian suppliers, and deliveries through 2030. One side is trying to prove that Canada cannot afford to keep the shelf empty. The other is trying to prove that the shelf is no longer the only place business can happen. Keep an eye on the provincial restocking decisions, the next SAFE contract, the federal procurement awards, and every American industry asking for relief. The old market may reopen. Canada's new partner was already waiting before Washington made the demand. Before you go, I mentioned this earlier, and I mean it. If this trade war has you even slightly worried about your retirement, the Buffett Blueprint is the guide I put together for exactly this moment. Your 401k, your Social Security, and your fixed income investments, one clear plan, written in plain English, with practical steps you can begin using this week. The link is directly below this video and in the pinned comment. Look for the Buffett Blueprint. Subscribe to the channel for more calm, evidence-based analysis of the trade decisions affecting your money and retirement. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.